Oh boy, it's been a bit. We finally have a new React release. I've seen a lot of people who are concerned that the React team's been quiet lately and not releasing anything. Well, ReactConf is coming up, and I expected we'd have to wait until then. I was honestly kind of dreading it because I hate filming videos in hotel rooms when I want to be out hanging out with my friends at a conference. Thankfully, they preempted us and put out React 19.2 today, a week ahead of the event. This is great because I can cover it now, but it also means they're probably holding some really cool things for ReactConf. So let's cover all of the stuff that they just dropped in this new release, a lot of which I've been waiting for a while and I'm really excited about, knowing that there's probably some even cooler, bigger announcements coming very soon down the pipeline. I am so excited to dive into all the cool things the React team has been working on. Man, activity in particular is so cool. I'm so curious what did and didn't make it in. You guys are going to see my organic reaction as I read through the 19.2 notes. But before we can dive in, we got bills to pay. Quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll go deep. If you've been watching my videos lately, you're probably already familiar with today's sponsor, Convex, the backend platform that I went from absolutely hating to not really knowing how to build without. Okay, I do know how to build without Convex, but I don't want to anymore, and I've moved everything I'm building over to it, from all of my side projects to T3 Chat. So it's clear I love Convex, and thankfully they love me too. So much so, they gave me no guidance on how to do these ads. So I'm gonna push the limits a little bit because they didn't tell me I can't. Let's talk about reasons to not use Convex. Reason 1. You want your data team to run queries in your application database. If it's common at your company for people who are doing data analysis stuff to just use your production database, Convex is not great for that because it's not built for these giant queries that touch tons of things in the data. It's good for application data, things that your users are touching, not things that your data team is touching. You can just drain all of this data over to a better database for it, but if you don't want to, Convex isn't for you. Reason 2. You don't use TypeScript. If your company's not using TypeScript on the front end, there's a very good chance Convex is not going to make your life easier. If you're not using it on the back end, Convex still might help out a bit, but generally speaking, if you're not leaning into TypeScript, Convex is not going to be very helpful for you. But if you are, you really should check out Convex. Reason 3, you hate open source. Not only is Convex open source, they actually contribute a bunch of money to various different open source projects that they rely on and they know the community of people here rely on too. I think that's awesome, but if you hate open source and think all code should be paid, definitely don't use Convex. It's not for you. And then point 4, if you're an engineer that likes to spend most of your time gluing things together and hoping that they stay together, and that's what you're paid to do, Convex is going to throw all of that work away because they make it way easier to compose your applications with a better set of primitives. They're not taking away the engineering work, they're just giving you a different set of building blocks. But if you really love the blocks you have today and you're not willing to give them up and you're paid a bunch of money to maintain them, Convex probably isn't for you. For literally everyone else, you should probably just be using Convex. Don't believe me? Go give it a shot now at soydev.link/convex. React 19.2 is now available on NPM. This is our third release in the last year, following 19 in December and 19.1 in June. In this post, we'll give an overview of the new features in React 19.2 and highlight some notable changes. So the big new features are Activity Use Effect event, finally a new use effect based hook. I've been keeping an eye on the development here for a while. Also cache signal and new performance tracking stuff. They also added some stuff to React DOM, which is a separate library from React. People seem to forget that a lot, but it includes partial pre-rendering as part of React itself, which is huge. We've been hacking this in with Next.js for a while, and I'm pumped to have it as part of React itself. They also made some changes that might break things for some people, but also help people out for other stuff. Very excited to look through all that. First, we got to talk about the new features. Activity. Activity lets you break your app into separate activities that can be controlled and prioritized. You can use Activity as an alternative to conditionally rendering part of your app. So if you previously had something like is visible, you render a page, but now you have to wait when visibility toggles to render and show you the page. It'd be really nice if you could have it running and rendering in the background when there is nothing higher priority rendering. So it's ready to go as soon as you change that toggle. And that's what Activity allows. If something is in a hidden activity, so it is activity mode equals hidden, it's deprioritized, which will hide the children, unmount the effects, and defer updates until React has nothing left to work on. So React will prioritize everything else in the tree and then render this so that when the toggle changes, it's already ready to go and stored in memory. But when it is set to visible, it just renders normally. It can use the cached render if there is one, or it will just render immediately if there isn't, or you set it to visible by default. Super, super powerful. This means you can pre-render and keep rendering hidden parts of the app without impacting the performance of anything else that's visible on the screen. You can use Activity to render hidden parts of the app that a user is likely to navigate to next, or to save the state of parts the user navigates away from. This helps make navigation quicker by loading data, CSS, and images in the background, and also allowing back navigations to maintain state such as input fields. They have a pretty good demo of activity on the official React docs, so I'm just going to show that quick to give you guys a better idea. Here we have a basic example of different tabs. So we have the active tab. It starts as home, and when you click post, it switches to posts. And we have a suspense here where if anything's loading, it will show the H1 loading. It renders home and it renders posts. So watch what happens when I click posts. We get loading, and then it loads the posts in. If we go into post.js, that'll make sense because it's fetching data from /posts, which is a fake function that takes time to run. Now, if we go back, it's already loaded, so it happens quick. When I reload this example and click it, it has to load, which is kind of lame because when we're on this page, it'd be nice if this was already rendered and loaded or could happen in the background on a lower priority. If we go down here to the activity-based version, we'll see activity, mode, active tab is home, visible, otherwise hidden. Same deal with the posts tab. If it's posts, it's visible, otherwise it's hidden. But that means it's rendered still. It's in the virtual DOM still. It's able to get its data and do its stuff without running effects. And then I click posts, and now it's loading immediately because it already was there. But if I click it instantaneously, we'll still see loading because it does kick off the loading as soon as this refreshes. But if we sit on this page for a while and it finishes in the background, then we click it, it's immediate. This is really, really nice. Use event effect. This one I'm very excited about. I've wanted better effect-like patterns for things that I want to run cleanups on, but aren't traditional effect type things. I'm so tired of doing like a use state and then an effect to do the connection and disconnection work for like connecting to a chat room with a WebSocket. Lots of little things that you have to do multiple layers for that should just be one consistent layer, and they're finally leaning into this a bit more now. There's a common pattern with use effect, which is to notify the app code about some kind of event from an external system. For example, when a chat room connects, you might want to display a notification. So here we have a connection, we create it, connection.on, we want to show notification showing that you connected. Then we run connect, and now this connection.on fires. The problem with the code above is that a change to any value inside such an event will cause the surrounding effect to rerun. Yeah, so if anything changes around this that causes a new connection, this will get run again. This makes sense for values related to the effect logic itself, like room ID, but it doesn't make sense for the theme. Like if the theme changes, we shouldn't disconnect and reconnect, even though we're using the theme for the show notification here. To solve this, most users just disable the lint rule and exclude the dep, but this can lead to bugs since the linter can no longer help you keep the dependencies up to date. You need to update the effect later. With use event effect, you can split the event part of the logic out of the effect that emits it. So here we have use effect event, which will use the latest version of these things here. It's almost like you're binding a ref to this function. So this doesn't ever change, so to speak. This as a dep won't cause use effect to rerun if things within it change. Notice that there's no dep array on use event effect. You're just defining it. The cleaner alternative before was what Gabriel showed in chat here. You put the theme as a ref. It'd reference the current value of it. Now we don't have to do shit like that anymore. We can define an event effect, which is clearly telling the React compiler, the developer reading, and the runtime, hey, I want this function to be called whenever it's ready with the exact values that exist at the time it is called. Don't worry about recreating it when the values change. I have a feeling we'll see a couple more things like this in future React changes because they're very useful for the compiler. The React compiler can see these types of things and build really powerful trees to cache and not validate things that it doesn't have to, and just make the effect itself as simple and consistent as possible. My guess is that this is way easier to optimize than a bunch of weird ref checks. It's also clearer and more concise for us to read. Hypothetically, LLMs will be really good at writing this too, and the result is that the compiler can make more efficient code more easily. Similar to DOM events, effect events will always see the latest props and state. Effect events should not be declared in the dependency array. You'll need to upgrade the ESLint plugin so the linter doesn't try to insert them as dependencies. Note that effect events can only be declared in the same component or hook as their effect. These restrictions are verified by the linter. They're putting a lot more work into the linter too for these same reasons. That is interesting though. You can't pass this onConnected as a prop to something else and then have it call that as an effect. You have to define this in the same component for this. Really smells like compiler stuff, because if you didn't know this, the React compiler doesn't have a overview of the whole code base. It's going on a component by component basis. So if the effect event is handled some other place and then the prop is being passed to the component, the compiler can't do anything with that. There's a future where that changes, but we're not there yet. So when do we actually use this? I love these little notes they do. They're very helpful for making your mental model around it. You should use the useEffect event hook for functions that are conceptually events that happen to be fired from an effect instead of a user event. I think about this a lot when I'm designing applications. How much of the behavior can I move to a user action? Instead of having a use effect that when a certain value changes runs some code, can I have the value change that a user does trigger it? So instead of fetching on an effect because the status changed to loading, can the user clicking the button that triggers loading also trigger the fetch call at the same time? How much functionality can you move to be user-driven in your code to make a more reliable path where React isn't being used for anything other than showing the UI updates and showing the state when it's done? Ideally, the on-click is where the behavior should happen, not the on-click triggering some new state change that triggers an effect that then does what you want. That makes a lot of sense when you're doing user-driven events. But when you're doing something that the user isn't driving, like connecting to a new chat room or changing their URL, triggering other things, there are now things that feel like those one-off events that you want to have go one time. That's what this is for. Effect events, which is the language they have coined here, is an alternative to user events. I like this framing a lot. They actually have a whole separate article they just put out too of separating events from effects. This is really good to have as a resource. I am thankful there's more documentation about this because I see these problems in a lot of React code bases, and now I have a thing that I can reference. Good stuff. I really like this on-visit example. Let's say you want to log when a user goes to a page. So you have a log visit function. So whenever the URL changes, you run the effect and you log the user doing the visit. But if you want to include how many items they have in their cart when this happens, and you put this in as well, now you're either getting an error because you didn't include the items here, or if you do include it, now it's going to run on every time you add an item, even though it's not a visit, that is an item addition. So you get this function being called erroneously a bunch. I'm sure our friends over at Cloudflare can't relate to this at all. So if you split this out to onVisit being an event effect, we pass in the URL still. We use the visited URL and the number of items. The number of items comes from this other prop. Now this is isolated. And the only thing that will trigger this call is when URL changes. It lets you break out those dependencies very explicitly to keep them from triggering updates. I like this a lot. They give the example of just passing the URL here and triggering manually with this as a dep that's not even being used. But they recommend that you explicitly pass it just to make it clearer in the code here. This becomes especially important if there's asynchronous logic inside the effect. Here, URL inside of onVisit corresponds to the latest URL, which could have already changed, but the visited URL corresponds to the URL that originally caused the effect. This is actually a really good call-out because if you're navigating and the previous onVisit hasn't fired yet, now it's going to log the wrong value if it's being passed through here. Good callouts, good docs. Here's a fun example from Gabriel for their Axiom library for reporting web vitals to Axiom. Here you'll see they have the metrics all as refs so that when they call the effect, they don't have to have dependencies for it. And they run this on visibility changes instead. This is the type of code that gets way easier to write when you have these new custom hooks. And now we have cache signal, which is only for server components. It's been a bit since we talked about those here. Cache signal allows you to know when the cache lifetime is over. So if you're using the cache function from React, which, how do I even describe this function? It lets you cache the results of a data fetch or computation. It's very useful for a ton of different things as a base level primitive for calling a function in multiple places. So if you're checking auth in a request and you're checking it in 15 places, if you cache the function, it'll only get called the first time, and then that value will be reused across the other times it's called for that render, which is really useful for server components when you're rendering a giant tree that might have to call a function many times when in reality it just needs the data. So if you have this get metrics function and you want to call it in 3 different components, now if you wrap it with cache, the first time it'll compute, then other calls to it in this render won't have to recompute it. But what about when it's done? That's what cache signal is for. So if you want on completion of this to have some signal that will clean up after, disconnect, or do whatever else, like maybe close a connection to a database or something, now you have this special function that will get called on cleanup at the end of that render. So when the successful render occurs or the render was aborted or fails, now you have a signal for cleanup. Nice. So in this example with fetch, if you want to cancel the fetch when this happens, Now, if the component render stops or fails before the fetch is completed, this signal, like, the JavaScript signal standard, will trigger the cancel, and now the fetch will die. So it won't complete the fetch, which is really, really cool. It does not work for stopping things that were fetched outside of rendering, though. Very good call out. You can also ignore errors after React has finished rendering. Function throws may be due to cancellation, like the database connection's been closed. You can use the aborted property to check if the error was due to cancellation or due to a real error. So we try this query database. If it's not aborted, then we log the error. Otherwise, we don't. So we don't log errors when people are aborting the render. Very interesting. I see people in chat, like Gabriel, saying the naming is probably not great. Yeah, I agree. It's also like this only makes sense when you recognize cache as part of a given request or render, not as the server persisting the data. This isn't cache in the sense that the server keeps it at a KV and reuses the data for different requests. It's a request level cache. So when the server tree is doing a server-side render pass for server components from the root down, if 3 different things in that component tree are requesting the same data, and that data is coming from a cache-wrapped function, it only has to be hit once, and all of the other components get the same data immediately without having to use something like a React context. And the signal as a way to do specific work or cancel specific things during that flow makes a lot of sense. So it's basically context. It's effectively a context-like layer for when you're doing a single server-side render pass. It doesn't need to be context because it only needs to go one direction. With context, you need to be able to expose functions that change the state of things. This is just top-down. It only goes one way, which is a huge implementation difference. And it is effectively dedupe. If they just called it dedupe, I think this would solve a lot of problems. No, it can't be render signal because it isn't React DOM, but oh boy, yeah. Sure, this won't get confusing for people at all. Oh boy, this one's really exciting to me as someone who cares way too much about performance of my applications, as you guys know from me slaving over the details with T3 chat. The new custom tracks for Chrome Dev Tools are really exciting. The idea of having information that's React specific in the performance dev tool. Oh, see this little thing there? Scheduler, React icon. This is a custom track in the scheduler that React made for us to look at the performance of things happening in React. You can see an event occurred, a render is occurring, the commits for the render occur. Oh, this is so good. This is so good. You'd even see suspense and transitions separate from each other. Oh, I'm super, super hyped for this part in particular. So what do we have here? We have the scheduler. The scheduler track shows what React is working on for different priorities, like blocking for user interactions or transition for updates inside of a start transition. Inside each track, you will see the type of work being performed, such as the event that scheduled an update and when the render for that update has happened. We also show information such as when an update is blocked, waiting for a different priority, or when React is waiting for paint before continuing. The scheduler track helps you understand how React splits your code into different priorities in the order it completed the work in. There's also a component track, which shows the tree of components that React is working on, either to render or run effects for. Inside, you'll see the label such as mount for when a child mounts or effects are mounted as well, or blocked for when rendering is blocked due to yielding to work outside of React. A component track helps you understand when components are rendered or run effects and the time it takes to complete the work to help identify performance problems. So cool. And just seeing your components and how long they take to render and the blocking stuff in them. Oh, this is so good. Now the real question is, does this work yet for my browser, Helium? Here we go. Record, click, show, stop. Here we are. That is so cool. We can see the conditional demo in the complex component blocking render for exactly 1 second, and see the blocking part here that the render is blocking everything else and that transitions and suspense have nothing going on. But if we go to the activity version, record, show, stop. Now we can see that the activity demo can render, the complex demo or the complex component renders while the activity demo renders, but this one isn't blocking. They can render in parallel now. We're not using suspense or anything for it, but just having this level of depth of what component renders where, this is going to be so useful. I'm genuinely hyped about this. This might be the biggest change for me, doing crazy profiling stuff. Whew. Very fun. And now we get into the new React DOM features, specifically partial pre-rendering. I have loved PPR for a while. It's such a cool concept. The idea that you have some parts of your app that are static, some parts that aren't. And instead of carefully defining and carving out where each boundary starts and ends, you just do the thing. And whenever you hit an async boundary, you trim that out and send that down a stream later. Super cool stuff. This is now built into React DOM. This lets you pre-render part of the app ahead of time and resume rendering it later. What this is cool for is if you want to cache the part of your app that is the same for everyone. Maybe you have a website like Amazon, where the majority of the content on a page isn't user-specific. It's content that is generally like the frame of the site. But then you have the user icon in the corner that's specific to that user, or maybe the pricing is different. The parts that are unique to a specific user are also almost certainly going to be asynchronous, which means that for that given request, the async parts are user-specific. The synchronous parts probably aren't. If you can store the synchronous parts, like the shell of the application, the top nav, the Amazon logo, all of those things, as a cached HTML page, an entity that can be served from a CDN immediately, and then the rest of the dynamic parts can stream in after while sharing the same React tree, it's magical. I've covered partial pre-rendering in multiple videos. I'm sure FaZe will show some of the thumbnails on the screen if you want to go look at those. Highly recommend them. It's a really cool pattern, but it was really deeply ingrained in Next.js with a couple hacks around the React renderer. Now it's built in. You have the prelude and the postponed. So prelude is the work that can be done without any async boundaries being hit, and then postponed is that async work. So you can save the postponed state for later, and you can send the prelude state to a client or to the CDN or do whatever else you want with it. And then you can call resume with the postponed piece later on. So now imagine that the user got the prelude some other way already. You still will call the same function, throw out the prelude because you already have that, and then you just use the postponed part. Or you can call resume and pre-render to resume to get static HTML for static site generation. So here we're assuming you've already rendered the site, and we're just passing the postponed state. Okay, back to what's going on here. It's not a new release without some notable changes, especially if some of these are breaking. So let's take a look. The batching of suspense boundaries for SSR. Oh, this is really nice. This is really nice. There's been a lot of back and forth about how suspense boundaries should behave. I did a long video about the drama around this. Now the server-side stuff is getting better batching support. We fixed a behavioral bug where suspense boundaries would reveal differently depending on if they were rendered on the client or when streamed from server-side rendering. Starting with 19.2, React will batch reveals of server-rendered suspense boundaries for a short time to allow more content to be revealed together and align with the client-rendered behavior. That's really nice. A lot of people don't realize how much suspense and the boundaries in React are doing under the hood. There's a lot of little things. Like if we go back to the example with activity from earlier, if you were to toggle to posts, for example, and the content was to appear within a couple milliseconds, I think it's set to 100 or so, it won't show the loading state. It will immediately show the content. But if it takes long enough, it will show the loading state. But the idea of waiting to show the state is something that's relatively well established and is built into suspense. Another thing it will do is batching. If multiple suspense boundaries resolve at around the same time, those suspense boundaries are going to come in together, so you don't have a bunch of things popping in one and then 15 milliseconds later another and then 70 milliseconds another. This is all handled really well by React itself. Unless you were streaming from the server where it would just show it immediately. And then if 3 things stream in one after another, you get pop-in all over the place. Now they'll wait a couple milliseconds and see if more content comes in and batch the reveal. This fix is also preparing apps to support view transition for suspense during SSR. By revealing more content together, animations can run in larger batches of content and avoid chaining animations of content that are streamed in close together. Whew, very good. I am so excited for view transition. I have a feeling we'll hear more about view transition very, very soon. Back to the new stuff here. The web stream support for Node is actually a really interesting change, not for the reasons you might think though, because you should just use Node streams by default. If you're confused about this, you're one of many. Web streams are an actual W3C standard for streaming information and creating streams as JavaScript code. Node streams are an existing implementation in Node that happened before web streams were a standard. Node streams are much better implemented and also have a ton of benefits like compression by default that you don't get in web streams. Web streams are a web standard, which vary a lot in quality, Node streams are a node standard, which have their moments where they're not great, but here it's a meaningful improvement for the standard. So why would we want WebStream support for Node? Turns out there's a lot of Node environments that aren't real Node environments and prefer web standards to Node standards. Things like Cloudflare workers, for example, don't have Node streams implemented directly, and instead you can use web streams. But if you're building on top of a framework that's using Node and expects the streams to work through Node, good luck, have fun. Now, building your own SSR with streams on top of a platform like Cloudflare Workers got way easier with WebStream support in Node. It's slower and might hurt the quality of the performance you're getting on the other end, but at the very least, it's now built in as a first-class citizen. Cool to see. An updated ESLint plugin for React hooks. They're putting a lot of work into the plugins for React hooks and ESLint stuff in general because compiler benefits greatly from having these rules followed. The rules of React are essential to getting the best out of compiler, so they're going really hard on these packages to make your code base yell at you better when you're not following these rules. They even made a separate package for recommended legacy if you really don't want to use the new rules yet or take advantage of compiler. They also are updating the prefix for useID. If you're actually digging in and matching on these formats, I'm curious what you're doing, but this will be very nice for when view transition happens and supports these XML things. Then there's a pile of small changes. Hopefully none of these will break things for you. Should be pretty good overall. I am hyped. This is a very good release that really feels like it's setting things up for a wonderful future for React. If this is 19.2, I think it just made 20 a much more interesting launch. I am hyped for where React is going. I am excited to see them not too scared to introduce new APIs. I've been a bit worried that the React team would steer away from doing those types of things because LLMs are already trained really well on writing React code. Adding new features makes it harder for those things to use them because they're used to the same React syntax we've been using for decades now. These aren't big lifts. They're very small, like 2 lines of code you add in some places, but they enable a bunch of cool wins like view transitions, better compiler performance, and more. And it really does feel like the React team is trying to minimize user-facing change for us as devs, while also maximizing the potential of new tools like compiler so that us as devs and other things like LLMs and coding agents don't have to learn too much more new stuff and our code just gets better and faster. That's the ideal. No change on our end, code base just gets better. Really cool. And all of these pieces, all of these changes are in many parts stepping stones towards that beautiful, wonderful potential future. I know it's a small release, but it's a really cool one. I'm curious how you guys feel. And until next time, peace nerds.